And so these are the different projects that we've worked on. So if you look through the data storytelling workbook, you'll see a bunch of stuff that I've done. And those are all attempts to illustrate research, but from a place of that informed knowledge as being a researcher myself. And that can be very helpful when you're kind of unpicking more complex stuff, is doing both. So in this workshop, I'm going to give a brief overview of why and when we advocate for data comics and graphic medicine. And I'll also talk about that model that Anna mentioned in her presentation that I've kind of stumbled on. And then we will be doing 2 activities from the forthcoming The Data Storytelling card game. That's something that we're developing, that we've in various put on hold because of COVID and get back into it because of COVID. Type of situation. And then I will release this, but the Padlet is where we'll put some group discussion, and we'll go to that at the end. That's also where you'll put your activities from the main part of the activity. So I will give you that link early. Great. So again, what you'll need is you'll need a second screen. That's just so that you can have the Padlet open. Or even just you can switch between the browsers, because once you go into the breakout rooms, you won't have my slides, but I've put the instructions again in the Padlet, so you always have those. A pen and paper. It doesn't have to be super fancy paper or super fancy pens, whatever you have on hand, but dark colors on light paper show up better. And then we'll be asking you to take pictures of kind of the sketches that you do. For those that want to share, you can either use your smartphone or in Padlet. I have a description of how you can use your webcam to do that. And so we will get started. So the very brief thing is what Anna was kind of talking about, is the dehumanizing elements of data storytelling that I want us to remember. So of all the things she talked about, the things that we'll kind of be thinking about in our exercise today is that authorial God's eye view perspective, the sanitizing experience and emotion, and then that reduction of complexity into simple demographics. And here we're not necessarily talking about a bunch of data complexity, but if we're having human subjects and they have complex lives. And so we can't just say, or always say and stick to very limiting ideas of demographics. But we can actually start to unpick these complex lives that this data comes from. And so the benefit of data comics is that they can disrupt authorial voices, they can refuse sanitization, and they can present complex personhood. And a lot of this is tied to the fact that when you're telling data comics that you have characters for, or you're trying to narrativize it, is you have to create characters, you have to create that world, and that's where you can embed this data into these stories. The can, I think, is very important. I am a trained artist, so I have spent years and years in my simple illustrations to learn the communication of aesthetics and visuals. So it won't always work. It does take having the right artists, but it also takes including them in the right ways. And that's something that we discuss in the 4 C's of healthy collaboration. But it means letting your illustrators become research illustrators and having them be a part of those conversations for a more informed idea. When we talk about graphic medicine, one of the things that I have always been advocating for is this idea that graphic medicine, and specifically the comics medium, is approachable, accessible, and relatable. So for anybody, graphic medicine is comic books about health and healthcare. Is a very simple definition, but these are good principles for thinking anytime you're making visual stories, and even when you're taking your data and you're putting it into stories for audiences that don't have the same expertise as you. And so how do you make your data or your story approachable, accessible, and relatable? So approachable is really, can it be approached? When people come in contact with your visuals and your stories, is there too much jargon? Is it not, can it not reach them? So that initial thought goes, I can't engage with this. So with the comics medium, they're prevalent in pop culture, but they're also created and read in many cultures across the world, although they don't all call them comics and they have different histories tied to them. But it is an approachable medium in the sense that it has a familiarity. The accessibility is once you have someone engaging with your story, is the language you use accessible throughout? Do you define things in an accessible way? And does it resonate in that sense that the story is accessible because it can mean something? And so is the medium of comics is used in literacy training, and there's a lot of scholarship into why it works for that. The iconography that you use can link to local, regional, national identities. I will avoid saying a global identity or understanding, but there's elements that can sort of get at that depending on your story. Like if we're thinking about COVID, it's experienced very differently, but because the pandemic is so large spread, there's very tiny hints of it that might resonate across cultures. But so if you were trying to persuade policymakers in your local area, you might put iconography that they would recognize, the name of a store in the background that's local, and to build that emotional effect in their reading. And effective visuals can get closer to meaning than text. That doesn't account for everything, but if we're talking about something like depression, graphic medicine, there's tons of examples where a few comics without words has described what it's like to live with depression much more emotionally and effectively than a paragraph that I've ever come into contact with. And then relatable. And that's where we really get at this human side. So why are we making approachable? Why are we making accessible? And so we're doing this relatability. And so tells the human side of a health issue, and it builds communities.